Committee will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Senator Nelson, good to see you again. We welcome your testimony regarding NASA's fiscal year 25 budget request. The Biden administration is asking $25.4 billion for NASA. It's a roughly 2% increase over the fiscal year, fiscal 24. Funding NASA is critical to getting back to the moon, advancing our scientific understanding, and driving innovation. However, we remain accountable to the taxpayer, and with the national debt skyrocketing, it's critical that NASA remain focused on its core mission. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, founded in 1958 in response to the so-called space race with the Soviet Union to land the first man on the moon. Today we find ourselves in yet another space race, this time with China. China has made aggressive investments in both deep space exploration and low Earth orbit. NASA's funding is critical to making sure the United States remains the international leader in space. Recently, Morehead State University in my district and their staff stepped up to help NASA during the Odysseus robotic moon landing, the first ever private spacecraft to land on the moon. Working with NASA, Morehead State was able to assist with establishing a command bridge to overcome communication lines issues after challenges in the landing process. I've reached the limit of my intellectual capacity thereby. And Senator Nelson, who is one of our former House colleagues, and then later the Senate, before taking on this challenging job he's in. But you accurately described it to me earlier by saying that Morehead State University was the savior of this historic mission. That's quite remarkable. We're fortunate to have with us in the audience today Dr. Ben Malfris, who led this effort at Morehead State. Doctor, stand up for us. Thank you for your work. This amazing story is just one example of the important work Morehead State is doing in a part of the country not traditionally known for space innovation. I'm so proud of the incredible work being done at Morehead State University to build the next generation of the space workforce to ensure the United States remains the global leader in space. Many of NASA's missions are important for our country's international leadership, economic success, and scientific advancement. However, it's the duty of this subcommittee to ensure taxpayer dollars are spent efficiently and to continue to thoroughly examine spending levels as we did in fiscal 24. Given the current spending environment, I want to urge NASA to continue to innovate through partnerships to reduce costs while not sacrificing mission advancements. NASA has set forth an ambitious but important agenda, and we look forward to hearing more about it today. So thank you, Bill Nelson, for joining us today. Let me recognize Ranking Member Cartwright for any remarks he may wish to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Senator Nelson, for joining us again and all the work you do to lead our very proud NASA program. NASA continues to be respected throughout the United States and the world as a leader in advancing our knowledge of the Earth, the solar system, the wider universe, as well as in advancing human space exploration, developing new technologies with wide applications, and helping to establish more fuel-efficient and environmentally friendly aviation, among other things. But it's an inspiration of young people to go into science, technology, engineering, and math. That's where the real value of NASA is, and you can tell young people are inspired when they wear those ugly NASA T-shirts, right? It's not fashion they're after, it's inspiration. It's my hope that NASA will continue to inspire young Americans and get them to pursue STEM-related careers, because it's from STEM-related careers that we create wealth in this country. It's always been that way. You look at the Fortune 500 list of corporations, the ones crowding the top weren't even around a couple of generations ago because they're based on some scientific or technological breakthrough, and that created wealth. And things like NASA inspire young people to go into STEM. I am also proud, sure, we can talk about Morehead State all you want, but there's the University of Scranton to talk about here too, Mr. Chairman. I am proud that Dr. Nathaniel Frizzell of the University of Scranton was selected by NASA to lead a citizen science investigation for the study of this month's solar eclipse. He and several of his students, along with an international network of ham radio operators, researched changes in the Earth's ionosphere during the eclipse, including how the sudden loss of sunlight during totality affects radio signals. You know, NASA has really, in my time on this subcommittee, NASA has moved from strength to strength. And under your tenure, Senator Nelson, I mean, the things that we have pulled off, flying Ingenuity on the surface of Mars, a helicopter powered by a battery in 1% atmosphere. Nobody thought we could do that. NASA did it. Opening up the James Webb Space Telescope. It had to perform 340 separate operations, each one of them perfectly, in order to open up and start operating and transmitting those amazing images that we got. It did. If one of those operations hadn't gone off correctly, it would have been space junk a million miles away, really expensive space junk. But it worked, and it's been working. And the list goes on and on. It includes the Mars Perseverance rover, OSIRIS-REx mission that returned an asteroid sample to Earth last year, among many other missions. NASA also continues its work on a number of critical Earth science programs aimed at advancing our understanding of the Earth and providing key information to guide our efforts to tackle the climate crisis and mitigate natural hazards. In addition, NASA's Aeronautics research program continues to be critical to advancing the Biden administration's goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions from the aviation sector by no later than 2050. And it's technological advances, engineering and science breakthroughs that are going to help get us there. I look forward to hearing more today from the administrator about NASA's plans to manage in a cost-effective manner these many critical missions and programs. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Senator Nelson, you're recognized for an opening statement. Without objection, your written statement will be inserted in the record. I would ask you to keep your statement hopefully to 5 minutes or less so we can have additional time for questions. You're recognized.
Thank you, and I will keep it to 5 minutes. There's so much to talk about. I can hardly say my name in 5 minutes, but let me just comment on what you've already noted, the position of Morehead State. This is exemplary of the can-do attitude in the NASA community, because the Ingenuity lander came down on the South in the South Pole region of the moon. And apparently one of its legs hit a rock and it tipped over. And so the antenna that is supposed to be pointed at Earth is now pointed in an opposite direction. And although they got enough telemetry to know that it was alive, all the experiments on this lander, they couldn't get the data. Somebody, and we're trying to find out who it is so we can give special recognition. It may have been somebody at JPL, Congressman Garcia. I just don't know at this point, but I'm going to find out. They figured that Morehead State, who has the antennas, that was communicating, since this was a commercial lander, it had 6 NASA experiments on it, one of which, by the way, was the way that it was able to land. It was a LIDAR, which is like a radar. And as it is circling the moon, the LIDAR on the lander is on the blink. And they figured out quickly to patch through to the NASA experiment, the LIDAR, and they were able to land. But it tipped over because it hit a rock. And some very smart person figures out Morehead State has the ability to communicate commercially, but Morehead State also has the ability to communicate with government missions through the Deep Space Network. That's our Deep Space Network. And they figured out how to do a patch so that in our big dishes, we could put enough throw weight in the message and could receive as well. And every experiment, both commercial and NASA, all were able to receive the information. And again, it's symbolic of how commercial and government can work together. It's a part of what we're doing. We're going back to the moon, this time with commercial partners and with international partners. The CLIPS program, of which Intuitive Machines was one, is a commercial lander. NASA gives them seed money, and then they go out and build a manifest and get clients to go on their lander. It becomes a business enterprise. And oh, by the way, they're going to the South Pole. We had 6 instruments, NASA instruments, on there. So this is symptomatic of the changes in our space program from a half a century ago when we went to the moon, but we went as the government program. We're going in a different way. And a lot of the things that you all will ask about and talk about today will have that theme running through it. So I'm within the 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman. I'll just stop there.
Director's recognition of Morehead State, which is a small Appalachian community. And the director was generous with his time recently by visiting Dr. Malfris and the Space Science Department at Morehead State. They now have their own department. You can get a degree in space science at Morehead State. And so they're attracting businesses now to come to be near that campus just for that reason. So thank you so much, Mr. Director. You were very generous with your remarks about Morehead State. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions for the witness. And I'll begin by recognizing myself. Well, we're into a new space race, in my judgment. This time for a sustained presence on the moon as the gateway to the exploration of Mars and beyond. China has made very significant investments in its space program. Mr. Director, can you provide some specific examples of investments NASA is proposing in your 25 budget request to maintain the U.S. edge over China in space?
Yes, sir. We intend to land humans first on the moon. We're going back to a different part of the moon. Last time, it was the equatorial part of the moon. We're going to the south pole of the moon for a different reason. We're going back to the moon for a different reason. We don't need to go to the moon just to go to the moon. We did that a half century ago. We're going to the moon this time to learn, to live, to invent, to create how we can exist in that hostile environment so that we can go to Mars. And because we're going to the South Pole, we think that there is water there. We know there is ice in the crevices. If this is the moon and this is the South Pole of the moon, the sunlight comes in at an angle. So any kind of indention is permanently shadowed. The moon doesn't revolve. And we have seen in those permanently shadowed crevices ice. So if there's ice, we're sending a couple of those landers, by the way, those commercial landers, the remainder of this year. And they're going to dig and see if there is ice. And if there's ice, water, there's hydrogen and oxygen. And we got a gas station. And so your question is about a competition with China. China has made extraordinary strides, especially in the last 10 years, but they are very, very secretive. We believe that a lot of their so-called civilian space program is a military program. And I think, in effect, we are in a race. China, for example, has said, and they usually telegraph what they're going to do. Their latest date that they have said that they're going to land is 2030. But that keeps moving up. And so I think it's incumbent on us to get there first and to utilize our research efforts for peaceful purposes. We now have upwards of 40 nations that have signed the Artemis Accords, which is a common sense set of declarations of the peaceful uses of outer space. My concern would be is if China got there first and suddenly said, okay, this is our territory, you stay out. That's not the peaceful uses. There is obviously, you don't want to interfere with each other, but don't go in and declare that this whole territory is suddenly yours. And by the way, anybody that doubts that, look what China's done in the South China Sea with the Spratly Islands. So that's a quick answer to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, those accords have brought countries all over the world together to have an important conversation about the future of space exploration. What role does NASA play in the current geopolitical environment that we're in, particularly as China continues to advance both its military and civilian space activities? What's at stake internationally if America loses its edge as the global leader of space exploration?
We're not going to lose that global edge, but you got to be realistic that China is really throwing a lot of money at it, and they've got a lot of room in their budget to grow. And their science is good. Their engineering is good. And the proof's in the pudding. They now have a space station up there. It's got 3 elements. They usually have 3 taikonauts, which is what they call the Chinese astronauts. And I think that we just better not let down our guard. Now, you know, we have utilized NASA because of the fascination with space around the globe. NASA is usually welcomed in most countries. And we have gladly reached out to other countries with not only goodwill, but a lot of practical things that we can do to help other countries. And it's not just necessarily in space. It may be our assets in space that are looking at the Earth. For example, we can look at a farmer's field and we can tell what the moisture content is there. We can predict floods. We can predict droughts. We can look at a forest and determine if there is disease in the forest, and we're looking from space. And therefore, that forest is subject to fire because it's diseased trees. We've gotten involved with regard to the wildfires, of being able to try to head those off by giving the cautionary note to the fire service. So there's a lot that we are doing. I would hope that the Chinese space program would come to its senses and understand that civilian space is for peaceful uses. But we have not seen that demonstrated by China.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Senator Nelson, you just mentioned something that I wanted to ask you about. I think all of us remember last year we spent the better part of a week trying to breathe smoky air on the East Coast of the United States. God bless them, they're kind of used to that in California and parts in the West. We weren't used to that, and we found out it came from Canada. It came from Quebec wildfires, and that's new. Now, you just touched on that about wildfires. The NASA budget submission for fiscal year 2025 includes an increase in earth science. And I'd like you to talk about this effort, in particular with the earth science budget, something a lot of people might not immediately think of when they think of NASA, and that's this Wildland Fires Project in cooperation with other federal agencies. Could you explain for us how you anticipate this effort from NASA's Earth Science Division can help communities all across the country and indeed North America better prepare for and respond to wildfires?
This request is a mere $20.4 million for the Wildland Fires Project, which supports what you just said, Congressman. The improved prediction, management, and mitigation of overall impacts of wildfires. And that's not only within the U.S., that's around the world as well.
And how does that happen? I mean, you mentioned it detects diseased trees.
Exactly. Also, our improved ability to predict the weather. You think of the weather as the National Weather Service. NOAA, we design, build, and launch those spacecraft that NOAA utilizes. But we also have ours that look at different things. We can even, from space, look at a desert and we can tell you if there's water underneath the sand. We have a project, a joint project with USAID, for example, called Severe, that we give the data for farmers to help them. And then USAID implements that in third world countries.
We can even detect if there's methane leaks from space, can't we?
It's unbelievable. We have a spacecraft we put up a year ago, and it was to look at dust storms. And lo and behold, one of the byproducts of it, it can detect methane emissions. And we've been able to go to industries that didn't even know they were emitting methane, and they're happy to receive that information so that they can stop the emissions.
Right, because leaking methane was losing money for them. Well, let me shift subjects for a moment. NASA's request for aeronautics research highlights an effort to reduce non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, noting that with increased scientific and engineering focus, this research could eventually lead to completely eliminating a major aviation greenhouse gas effect. Could you tell us more about the effort and how NASA is working to achieve emissions reductions in aviation?
Yes, sir. First of all, we're working to get an all-electric airplane, and we hadn't been totally successful on that yet. But we have about a $750 million project going with a major manufacturer. They've put in about $500 or $600 million. This is Boeing, to develop the next medium-range, single-aisle transport aircraft that will save 30% of its fuel. And the design is a high wing on the fuselage and a very long and thin wing, so long and thin that it has to have struts. And because of the greater efficient wing and it being high, you can put the bigger fan jet engine so that you can get all the more efficiency. The combination of the wing and the engines will bring 30% fuel savings. So that's one example.
Terrific. Final question. Cancer moonshot. The International Space Station budget request includes a renewed focus on cancer research that supports the President's cancer moonshot effort. Can you tell us how this research will help find cures for cancer?
This research is just coming into its own. And I have been very frustrated over the years because 38 years ago when I flew, my experiment was sponsored by the University of Alabama at Birmingham Comprehensive Cancer Center. That was my primary experiment, growing protein crystals in space. And the results were dramatic, how much clearer, purer, and larger they were of the identical protein grown on Earth in gravity. But now, over the years, it's just taking off because of the dedicated time of a national lab on the International Space Station, of the pharmaceutical industries going and experimenting. So we're having major breakthroughs on stem cell research, protein crystal growth research, and how this applies to cancer research. And I'm happy to provide details.
Well, thank you, Administrator Nelson. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ratterholt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, good to be with you today. Thanks for being here and your work at NASA. As is very evident by your comments, you take your job very seriously, and thank you for doing that. And I know you enjoy what you do, and so that certainly shines through. Of course, we talk a lot about Russia here on Capitol Hill, and but even with the illegal and the unjustified invasion that we've seen recently in Ukraine, the the American-Russian partnership on the International Space Station remains very cooperative, at least from my understanding. Considering this cooperation that has existed, do you see a future where we could work closely with Russia in space after the deorbit of the International Space Station?
Let me say that this cooperation's been going on since 1975, when in the middle of the Cold War, an American spacecraft, Apollo, rendezvoused and docked with a Soviet spacecraft, Soyuz, and the crews lived together, and that started what has been a continued cooperation. First, us going to their space station, Mir, the space shuttle docked there, and then the joint project of building the International Space Station together with the Russians, operating it together, and it would be very difficult to operate it by one or the other without the other. But it brings up the question. Given the fact of the inexcusable things that President Putin is doing in Ukraine, will that cooperation last? There is absolutely no indication that anything has changed in our professional relationship between astronauts and cosmonauts, between the NASA people in Moscow at Mission Control and the Russian people at Mission Control in Houston. And it has continued in a very professional and effective manner of operating the space station, receiving and sending astronauts, receiving and sending cargo. That has operated without a hitch. However, it brings a very important point.
Thanks. Well, let me ask you this question. Should we be concerned about a potential realignment of partnerships in space where the Russians work more closely with the Chinese?
We're concerned about that, absolutely.
And
not only the Chinese, but others.
And if so, what, which you agree to, which you say is the case, what indications do you see that demonstrate a closer collaboration with these nations currently?
Say that again now.
With that being the case, that you're seeing this realignment, what are you seeing that demonstrates this? What that backs this up?
The realignment?
The realignment, yeah.
Thus far, there's no realignment. There's not a hitch at all in our relationship with the Russians in civilian space. Get into military space, you got a whole different thing. But it is something that we have to be concerned about. So in our budget request to you is the fact that we desperately need, in the emergency supplemental appropriations, once you get through with this first tranche that you're considering, there's another one that's coming. It's been blessed by the White House, and it's our request not only to repair the damaged deep space antennas on Guam when the typhoon hit Guam, and that happened to DOD as well, but also an emergency appropriations request for a deorbiting vehicle so that we can start now, and in 6 years, when we want to deorbit the space station, and remember, this thing is 120 yards long. It's as long as a football field from goalpost to goalpost, and we've got to get it down safely. What happens in the next 6 years? Are we still going to have the same relationship that we can get it down with the Russians? We can't count on that. So we've got to start now to build that U.S. deorbit vehicle that could get the whole station down safely so it won't hit anybody or anything.
Thank you. My time's expired, so I yield back.
Mr. Tron?
Thank you, Administrator Nelson, and joining us today, and Chair Rogers and Ranking Member Cartwright. Maryland's a proud home of Goddard Space Center, 35,000 jobs, billions of dollars of economic output. OSAM 1, an important mission being led by Goddard, promises to deliver significant economic, strategic benefits to NASA, to the Space Force, and the commercial space sector. The ability to have space mobility, including satellite servicing, orbital debris removal. These are vital capabilities that will bolster the capacity and affordability of NASA's ongoing human and scientific exploration. In 2024, we invested Congress $227 million on the President's budget request for OSAM and put that language in place for a 26 launch. While we understand you have a lot of top-line pressure NASA is under, canceling that program would be catastrophic for scientific innovation in Maryland and result in the loss of 1,200 jobs, 600 civil, 600 contractors. I'm told the workers at Goddard are working hard to rescope the mission prior to the October review that Congress mandated in the 24 bill. Please share with us how NASA plans to implement the report language and how you will honor the rescoping of the mission, allow our contractors to continue with their procurement processes.
Thank you, Congressman. Understand the hand that you dealt us. And I say that you have dealt us. Had I been still a member of Congress, I would have voted for that compromise when you got to the point that you had to raise the debt ceiling so that the government of the United States, full faith and credit, wouldn't go into default. And in order to get the votes to get the debt ceiling raised, you had to agree to less spending. That less spending came in primarily on the non-defense discretionary spending, of which NASA is a part. So much so, it was a $2.5 billion hit to NASA in fiscal year 24, the current year, and another $2.3 billion hit to NASA in fiscal year 25 from what we had requested to take care of all of these things. The hit to science was $1 billion in just 24. And the hit to science in 25 was about $850 million. So with less money, we have to make some very tough choices. Your program is one of them. California's program is another one. Now, specifically OSAM, let me tell you what happened to OSAM. There was an independent review board that said the original forecast was to cost no more than $750 million and launch by 2020. And it's now 7 to 8 years behind schedule, and its latest figure is $1.6 billion. At the same time, what's happened to the marketplace is when OSAM was created, it was thought you'd go to low Earth orbit, punch holes in satellites, and figure out a way to refuel them. That technology has surpassed that. We now design satellites that can be easily refueled in low Earth orbit. The challenge is up 23,000 miles to resupply in geosynchronous orbit. But that's not what OSAM was designed to do. And so by us having to make hard choices, we understand the direction that you gave us. I know what the Maryland delegation did. I used to sit in the chairs that y'all sit in. I understand that. But we have to make choices. And we are, for 25, basically wanting us to move on from OSAM. We'll follow your direction for 24 in the appropriations. It's $237 million in this year that's being spent. But we're going to have to
What
move.
percent does that bring us to full completion on OSAM? When we spend that $237 million, where are we going to be at? How far deep in are we? 'Cause, I mean, Artemis is a lot years late too, and billions over budget also.
Well,
So it's the plague is everywhere.
You're nowhere near. But the things that we have developed and learned in OSAM, now we can go and help out DARPA. Now we can go out and help out DOD for the projects that they are trying to figure out to do on-orbit servicing up there at 23,000 miles up in geosynchronous. And that's our recommendation to you for 2025.
So you recommend scrapping the 26 launch date?
In the parlance of the South, this dog doesn't hunt.
I yield my time back. We'll come back to this.
Mr. Garcia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you again, Administrator, Senator Astronaut Nelson. I feel like you're padding your resume here a little bit now, but that's all right. You and I have had a lot of discussions over this Mars sample return. You just made an allusion to it, obviously, and you know how I feel right now. I'm not happy that the reprogramming decisions were made before we actually had bills passed. You ended up landing on the lower end of the spectrum between the band that the House passed and what the Senate passed. It's not just me; it's pretty much the entire California delegation, and probably one of the only times I've agreed with Schiff and been on a letter with Representative Schiff to give you testimony on how deeply this cuts. And it's not a California thing. My concern is not only about the 500 jobs already lost, in the last couple of months with the JPL layoff notifications, but the national security implications of losing more jobs and getting below what I would consider critical mass in terms of workforce at JPL. And the adjacencies between not just JPL relative to NASA, but also NRO and other national security implications. Those 500 jobs are gone. Those people have in many cases left California. They're in other industries now. They're working everything else. And I appreciate what NASA has done with the private-public partnership, and I realize there's a reshuffling of acquisition strategies and reprogrammings and IRBs taking place on the Mars sample return mission itself, and rebaselining the technical solutions there. But I'm concerned that we're below critical mass at JPL. So I want to remind everyone that the United States has actually never accomplished a soft landing on Mars without the talented minds at JPL. And, they call it the center of the universe for a reason. And so while I echo Mr. Trone's sentiment that, we're making these cuts, and I understand, and you're going to give me the same answer that you just gave him, I'm sure, on OSAM, but I worry that when we make certain decisions that we're cutting to the bone and actually, in this case, potentially amputating JPL. So I understand the rationale. I understand the rebaselining. And you're asking us to invest nearly $10 billion in the Moon to Mars mission for FY25. And I just want to, again, underscore the scientific and national security implications of what we have done here in JPL's role. So I guess the question is, what is JPL's future role in the Moon to Mars mission? And what are you doing, what is NASA doing now to protect the institutional knowledge, probably thousands of years of institutional engineering and program management knowledge at JPL that's getting scattered into the winds as we speak, and not necessarily staying in the space industry or aerospace industry. and, you know, what's necessary to keep, you know, American boots on the moon and on Mars if we're going to disintegrate this workforce? How do we reconstitute this? How do we preserve jobs? And my understanding is there's probably going to be even more layoffs coming up with FY25. You committed to not doing more in FY24, but I think the buzzsaw is coming out in FY25 again. So what's the plan to make sure JPL remains relevant?
First of all, my answer to you is not the same with regard to OSAM.
Okay.
It is an extremely important objective that we return those samples from Mars. We've got, we'll have about 30 titanium tubes the size of a cigar filled with cores that have been drilled. They've been drilled on a dry lake bed where a river came into that lake. And that is prime for us determining if there was life there. And then when we send our astronauts to Mars, then they won't go there because we'll have that proof. They can go to another promising area to see if there was life. When you are dealing with a budget that is overall almost $5 billion cut over 2 years, and science itself is cut $2.7 billion in those 2 years, and hopefully the following fiscal year we won't be under these constraints that the bill to raise the debt ceiling caused the constriction. Hopefully then we'll have a lot more flexibility. So I am quite sanguine about the future, and this is why
At JPL or on the MSR mission itself?
all of the above.
Okay.
Because, and that's why on Monday I announced, as I had discussed with you on Sunday, that I was going to ask that we simply cannot afford $11 billion that all the independent reviews have said, and you can't even get the samples back till 2040. That's when we're going to be sending astronauts up there. I said, let's start and think outside the box. So we've gone to JPL. We've gone to the rest of the NASA centers. We've gone out to industry with a request for information. By the 17th of next month, bring us your ideas as to how we could get this done cheaper and quicker. On the basis of that, the experts at NASA will make a decision. They'll give the seed money, and in the appropriation, we asked for $10 million so that we could put out that seed money in this request for information for 24. And let's see what we come back with in the answers this fall. And then at that point, we can make a decision. Now, as I mentioned to you, the head of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Dr. Lori Leshin, is very confident that they're going to be able to come up in their proposal that's going to be faster and cheaper. We want to see what other projects are out there. Remember, this is the most difficult thing that we're talking about, having an ascent come off of another planet.
That's right.
Rendezvous in Martian orbit with a European return vehicle, and that's Europe's cost, and bring those samples back to Earth. And so that is what I have directed, and that is what is underway. And I'm very optimistic as I talk to our scientists that it can be done.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. I'm out of time. A competition is good. I just don't want to lose that crown jewel down in Pasadena and JPL while we do that. So thank you, sir. Thank you again for your service.
Mr. Morelli?
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank the ranking member always. And thank you, Administrator Nelson, for your long service and dedication to our country and your leadership. I'll admit, I feel a little bit like a kid in a candy store. When I was a young man, NASA was everything to me. I thought it was, through the lens of NASA in my childhood, it was perhaps a time of great excitement, grand adventure, and new discovery, and so I think of it fondly. I had hoped when I was about 10 years old to be an astronaut. That was really my goal in life, but it turns out my skill set wasn't quite in line with what my dreams were. So, but it's not a bad consolation prize to be sitting here with you and talking about this grand future. I want to start by thanking you and NASA for coordinating astronaut Lee Morin's visit to Rochester. So thank you and your staff. He was in Rochester. We were on the path of totality, and he came up and spent the day with us at the Strassenberg Planetarium, and he was like a rock star. People lined up to take pictures with him and chat with him, and he was a great ambassador, so thank you. We were in cloud cover, but he helped bring a ray of sunshine despite the fact that we didn't quite see the eclipse, but really grateful for that and for the cooperation of your team. I was pleased to see in your budget request the inclusion of $252 million for the NEO Surveyor's important mission, some of which is being conducted in my district at the University of Rochester. And NASA completed the mission confirmation review, I think in 2022, committed to launching the surveyor by 2028. And I just wonder what critical next steps towards your goal as an agency of planetary defense.
A NEO surveyor, and I wanted to say to Congressman Garcia that it is also a JPL project as well.
Well, he had a lot of time, but I appreciate you continuing to
NEO surveyor is on track for 2028. NEO surveyor is a spacecraft. Also, the University of Arizona State is involved. And it's going out there and it's searching for killer asteroids. As you know, 2 years ago, we sent a spacecraft intercept an asteroid 7 million miles from Earth. We hit it at 14,000 miles an hour, bullseye, and it moved it. And so we now know that we can do that. NEO Surveyor is going to help us find a killer asteroid. This is one of the things that you all have mandated to us, is to go out there to look for asteroids that could threaten planet Earth.
Very good. Thank you. You talked a little bit about the investment in the International Space Station, which does enable a large group of people in the supply chain companies, including those in my home state of New York, to be a part of this and to support the ISS. NASA works with private companies under something called the Crew and Cargo Program to safely transport astronauts and supplies to and from space. Can you talk about why maintaining a regular cadence of flights is important? You talked a little bit about the ISS, but why is this important to their continued operations?
With regard to low Earth orbit, with regard to the moon, or both?
Both.
Okay, well, the more experience and testing that you do on a continual basis in a very hostile environment, the more you build your confidence and the more you reduce your risk. And that's why a continued cadence is so very important. It's also prudent to have a backup plan. And so years ago, when we said we're going to get commercial companies into delivering astronauts and cargo to the International Space Station, we wanted two. And the two were SpaceX and Boeing. And lo and behold, as it turns out, SpaceX has been flying cargo and crew for the last 4 years. And Boeing's first launch of the test crew of 2 astronauts will be somewhere around May the 1st. And so that constant repetition reduces your risk. The same is true for the moon. However, the moon is a much different thing, a much more expensive proposition, and that cadence is a lot more infrequent, but we still hope a cadence of about one a year.
Very good. I had additional questions, but I'm not sure whether there'll be a second round, but I can submit in writing if there's not. I appreciate the time, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for being here today. When will China become the global leader in space exploration?
Well, if we have anything to do with it, they won't.
That is exactly the right answer, and we have to make sure that China is never the global leader. The United States will always lead that way. Senator Nelson, maintaining the Artemis mission schedule is essential to ensuring we return U.S. astronauts to the lunar surface before China accomplishes a crewed moon landing. We know there are delays in Artemis 2 and 3. Does NASA have the flexibility to adjust the CONOPS as necessary to maintain the Artemis schedule?
Well, the Artemis schedule is going to be operative when it's safe for our astronauts to fly. The present schedule is that we will launch the first crew around the moon to check out the spacecraft Orion and its life support systems, and that will occur in September of next year, which is September of 25. The schedule presently is for the first landing to occur 1 year later, in September of 26. That landing is dependent upon the first commercial lander, which is SpaceX. They are presently testing their big rocket. It's the largest, most powerful rocket ever, from Boca Chica, which is just to the north of the mouth of the Rio Grande. And we have as a backup the second round of competition, which was won by Blue Origin. But they have said, since they are 2 or 3 years behind on that second round, that they don't expect to be landing until 2029. So there's a lot riding on the first successful lander. If that's successful, Artemis 3, the first landing, then Artemis 4 is a larger, taller, more powerful rocket. It's an evolved space launch system. It goes off on a new and larger mobile platform because it's carrying not only the spacecraft, Orion, it's now carrying a component of what is known as Gateway, which is like a lunar space station. And that is scheduled to go about 2 years after the first landing. That's still SpaceX. Artemis 5, which would be a year or so later, would be the first landing of the Blue Origin lander.
You have highlighted this timetable, this domino effect, if you will, why it is so critical to make sure that that first domino lands correctly. And it's nothing easy about this, right? There's some growing pains that happen. You make some mistakes along the way. I think SpaceX has done an amazing job at correcting that, but we have to make sure that we do not get in their way. As long as they're meeting all the criteria and they're moving the ball forward, that first domino is critical to making sure that that fifth domino lays on time. On time, on target is important. My next question, are there any plans to further reduce the number of scientists and engineers that are working for NASA?
We need all that we can get, and I see no plans. We have about 15,000 civil servants, and we have about 45,000 contractors, all of which wear the NASA badge, so a total workforce of about 60,000. And we're not anticipating any major layoffs at all.
Excellent, because I'd urge you, as you're making these tough decisions, you can't just grow scientists, you can't just add them to the equation. They're an invaluable asset overall. And then the last question that I have for you is, do we know how many scientists and engineers are working on the China space program?
I don't. And of course, even if I dug, it'd be hard to pull that out. Maybe you could get it from the Intel committee. However, I caution that they have made huge strides in the last 10 years, and you better not take anything for granted.
I mention this because if we are in this space race with China, and if we are going to defeat this space race, it will not be defeated with words. It'll be defeated with actions, and those actions are our scientists going to work and delivering just like they always have. And with that, Chairman, I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Mr. Clyde?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Okay, Senator, good to see you, sir. As the Chinese Communist Party escalates its investment in space exploration, I want to piggyback on what Mr. Gonzalez said a little bit here. I want to underscore the critical importance of NASA in countering it. NASA's pioneering work not only advances our understanding of the universe, but also develops cutting-edge technologies important for maintaining military and economic superiority in the evolving space domain. However, I am concerned that NASA's advancements in space exploration, specifically its Artemis missions, are not remaining on track and on budget. A March 2024 60 Minutes report details significant questions surrounding this program and has continued ballooning costs and schedule overruns. In this report, NASA's Inspector General stated that, and I quote, significant reductions in cost and better planning, that without significant reductions in cost and better planning, the current trajectory of the Artemis program is not sustainable. In response, NASA's Associate Administrator in charge of the Artemis program said that NASA disagreed with the Inspector General's characterization of the current situation and stated that NASA has taken a, quote, affordable path for the Artemis missions. So, Senator Nelson, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with your Inspector General's characterization that the current Artemis cost trajectory is not sustainable? Please give me your thoughts on that.
Remember what President Kennedy said. He said, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Anytime you go and try to create a safe set of technology to put humans, particularly at the South Pole. I gave you that illustration. Right. If that's the moon and this is the South Pole and the light's coming in there.
I was listening.
It's pockmarked with craters, and the craters are completely in shadow or darkness.
Dark.
And therefore, you've got to be very precise in your landing. There's no room for error. Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong taking manual control, had to keep flying, and when he landed, he had just a few seconds left. He was avoiding boulders. He was avoiding craters. He had just a few seconds left when he shut down the engines. And so it's hard, but you got to do it as safely as you can. And when it's hard and safe, it's going to cost money. The James Webb Space Telescope that went over twice the amount of money and took twice as long, look what we are reaping from the James Webb Space Telescope, an understanding of the universe in ways that we never have, seeing galaxies that we never knew existed, etc. So we are trying to tighten up the spending on bringing a lot of those, some 15 individual contracts, and bring them together into a unified whole. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's not going to be expensive, because it is.
All right. Well, we just want to make sure that the taxpayer's dollar is spent the most effective and efficient way possible. That's why we're here. And, you know, we're already $34 trillion in debt, And so everything that we spend, we've got to, make sure we get the best value for it.
May I just add a comment? I don't want to take away your time.
Go ahead, sir.
I'll do it at the end of your time. Go ahead.
All right. Well, the OIG estimated that that each Artemis mission, that the launch would cost $4.2 billion per launch for Artemis missions. What do you say to that? I mean, do you think that's affordable?
As you launch more over time, you bring down the per unit cost.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's all the questions I've got for you. You're welcome to elaborate on what you wanted to talk about.
Yes, please. Understand that this isn't all like we're pouring money down a rat hole.
Mm-hmm.
Look what it's doing for our country. Look what happened when we spent the money on the Apollo program. 2 generations of technology development came out of it. The micro-miniaturization revolution came out of the Apollo program when we had to make things light in weight, small in volume, and highly reliable. And look at how that technology has spread through the American economy. Look at the jobs as a result of this program throughout the entire U.S. Look at the educational benefit. The fact that we are going and doing daring things. You go into any classroom in this country and talk about it, and immediately you have the attention of those children in that classroom. And they're getting excited about technology and engineering and mathematics. That is an intangible value to the space program that has reaped financial rewards many times over to what it cost on Apollo a half a century ago and what it is costing in our space program now.
I appreciate that perspective, Senator. And with that, I'm way out over time. I yield back.
Mr. Klein?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Director. Good to have you here. Like to continue the discussion about the Artemis Accords themselves and bring it down a little bit. They have an important role to play and demonstrate a new level of American exceptionalism to create a formal legal framework for space. And with Switzerland and Sweden becoming the 37th and 38th countries to join the Accords, this stands in stark contrast to China's competing International Lunar Research Station Cooperation Organization. What role and importance does continuing our international partnerships in low Earth orbit have on our long-term exploration strategy for the Artemis Accords?
We have 15 partners on the International Space Station. For example, in addition to the Russian section of the station, we have a Japanese module, we have a European Space Agency module. All these nations are directly participating. Nations are flying with us as international astronauts. And a lot of those that are cooperating now are going with us to the moon as well. For example, the mini space station that's going to be orbiting around the moon, it's already has the partners that will contribute to the building of it: Canada, UAE, the European Space Agency, and Japan. And there are more to come. And so this international cooperation has been phenomenal wherever we are, whatever we're doing. Look at the international cooperation on the James Webb Space Telescope. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is going out to the entire international community of astronomers.
Is Canada the largest contributor to the agreement other than the United States?
Which agreement?
Well, the Artemis, I would say the lunar mission.
The short answer is no.
Okay.
Eventually, the cost, for example, on the rocket, the life sciences, the life-supporting equipment is in what is known as the European Service Module. And that's attached underneath the capsule, which is Orion. And so at this point, it's probably Europe, although Japan is investing very, very heavily in our space program.
Gotcha. Now, the International Space Station, which is what I was moving toward, has also played its part and is home to many different types of advanced and expensive scientific equipment, most of which was not designated to be brought back to Earth. According to the National Academy's 2023 Biological and Physical Science Decadal Survey, it would cost U.S. taxpayers more than $1.5 billion to rebuild and launch these to some other commercial low Earth orbit destination. Can you talk about what's being done to preserve the equipment on the International Space Station as we make plans for a deorbit?
Well, the ones that have technological life, I'm sure there's going to be some kind of thought put into that of preserving that. Stripping it out if it's of still economic value and bringing it back before you deorbit the International Space Station in 2031. By the way, we don't deorbit until we have a commercial space station or stations, which we now have given the incentive money to at least 3 companies to build a commercial space station and show its economic vitality and its business case for being there. Okay. And that's our intention. Once we have a commercial space station, then we can train our astronauts there because our focus is not low Earth orbit at that point. Our focus is out there at the moon and beyond.
Right, but what we want to avoid is a gap that would cede the U.S.'s leadership in space to China, especially regarding low Earth orbit. Is there a plan in place to maintain American prominence and avoid gaps in human spaceflight capability and presence in low Earth orbit?
If I have anything to do with it, there's not going to be a gap.
Okay.
I'm expecting we're going to have commercial space stations.
In the next 10 years? Is that your anticipation?
By 2030.
Okay.
And if we didn't, then I'd make the case, if I were still at this table, I'd make the case that we need to continue the station until we do have alternatives. Because I don't think we want to give up the permanent presence in space.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Well, Mr. Director, we hope you still have that seat. Mr. Elsie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Good to see you again. Thank you for being here. Real quick, getting right to it, let's talk about aeronautics real quick and the low boom flight demonstrator. What do we see down the road as a benefit to spending money on that and the hypersonics? Real quick. I got a couple more after this one.
We are a research organization, but we are working on hypersonics. A commercial use of hypersonics is to get from point A to point B on planet Earth quick. There are obviously a lot of national defense issues with regard to hypersonics, but we do the research. Now, with regard to the low boom, this is the needle-nosed X-plane that's going to fly at the end of the year.
Okay.
To see if we can go supersonic and not create that jarring sonic boom, but because of its design, it recreates the shock wave so that it becomes a muffled roar.
And so the idea is to translate that research that you do into a standardized wing that other commercial carriers can start to pick up and advance much faster flight around the world.
A design so that commercial aircraft can then fly supersonic over populated areas.
Okay.
So that you could go from LA to New York and you could do it in maybe 2.5 hours.
Okay, perfect. This next subject is more of a comment that doesn't require an explanation. I will say that in the business that you're in and the operations that you conduct. My comment is this: anything that's not based on merit and performance in the risky operations that you undertake, and any money expended outside of that is a waste of money. That's my comment. I think you know what I'm talking about there. I just want that to be on the record, because I know we're spending $22 million on programs like that, and I think that while that in a $25 billion program, that is a minuscule amount, but it's $22 million that belong to the American taxpayer. Now, something more positive. Let's talk about your T-38s, which I have seen, haven't flown in yet, but would like to someday. They are pristine, and they're the earliest T-38s ever built. Do you see a transition coming for a different trainer-type aircraft? And if so, what is your timeline and what do you need?
The answer is likely yes, but I don't know the details on the trading out of the T-38s.
Okay.
They are still operating well.
Okay.
And that's one thing that NASA does well, is its maintenance program.
Yes, you have I mean, they are indeed 60, in some cases older years old, 60-year-old aircraft, the T-38 supersonic trainer aircraft. And these are the first off the line. So I've seen the professionalism and the love that's put into those aircraft. And with the more infrequent space flights, I know that keeping pilots and keeping astronauts airborne is extremely important, and doing so economically and safely is important to me too. So I just want to make sure that as that need comes up, we need to lead turn it as quickly as possible to make sure y'all have what you need.
You know, the T-38s are so good for the military, they're used as the aggressor aircraft
That's
on
correct.
a lot of the war games.
That's right. That's right. My time is winding down. Thank you for your time. Always good to see you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There is, I think, request for a second round of questions. Mr. Director, if we do a second round, we'll try to keep it as brief as we can, given your schedule. Is that okay with you?
I'm here at your pleasure, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, we'll do a second round. We will limit remarks to 3 minutes each. And we'll lead off with Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Nelson, in the budget request, NASA identified Mobile Launcher 2 as being the critical path to Artemis 4. That means that delays to the Mobile Launcher 2 would delay the Artemis 4 launch. Am I correct so far?
Correct.
All right. And that'll be the second Artemis moon landing mission. The first crewed gateway mission is currently scheduled to launch in September 2028. The question is, what steps is NASA taking to reduce the risk of delays to Mobile Launcher 2 that would inevitably delay the launch of the Artemis 4 mission?
I have met personally with the CEO of the well-known international company that has built that. They had really dropped the ball, but they have really picked it up. And I am led to believe that I think they're on schedule now.
Keeping a close eye on them, are you?
So much so, eyeball to eyeball with the CEO.
Good to know. Good answer. Thank you, Mr. Administrator, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Clyde?
I just have one question for you, Senator. Has NASA ever provided an official cost estimate for the Artemis 3 mission?
By breaking it out into one mission, normally what you do is you would take your research and development cost and you would amortize that over all the missions that you're going to have in the future, instead of piling all of that on the first landing, which is Artemis 3, which is what you asked.
Right, that's correct.
We can get you whatever figure you want.
Okay, all right. I would like to see kind of what y'all figure Artemis 3 would cost, and if you're gonna, take that and then build upon it, as you said, Artemis 4, Artemis 5, it would be interesting then to see I'd like to see what the additional costs of what you think that the further missions would be, so that we can kind of see a whole end game here.
And we don't intend just to go to the moon for 3 or 4 flights, and that's it. I mean, we're planning this to keep going out into the future until we get sufficient technology and systems that we think we can go to Mars. And I think that's in the 2040s. In the meantime, we're going to be doing a lot of science on the surface of the moon, such as just last week, the Japanese government is going to do the cost and building of a pressurized rover. And that's going to give our astronauts the ability to go out and to stay on the surface for 30 days because they will have a mobile environment in which in and out of the rover, but they go in and out of a lockout room, and they can take off the spacesuits that they have to use outside, and then they can live and run around. And when the astronauts are in it, it's going to be autonomous, and they can operate it from Earth as it will roam around. So it'll give a greater range that we can explore the South Pole of the moon.
I'm looking forward to seeing your plans. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Trone.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Administrator, while China is aggressively deploying more spacecraft to the moon, they had another successful launch on March 19th. Here in the U.S., we have an opportunity to catch up by combining forces with some of our domestic commercial industry partners. The CLPS missions are wonderful, as recently demonstrated by the Intuitive Machine's successful lunar landing. So why are we not using the same techniques to get these lunar orbiters around the moon that China has?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing with the CLPS mission, CLPS, that you mentioned. We are using commercial enterprises to bear the cost of landers of which we put NASA instruments that in effect become scouts for us before we ever send our astronauts to that part of the moon. Now, is that what your question is?
Yeah, we're trying to get at what's the Chinese are doing, you think, on the backside of the moon. Do you have any insights in that?
They are going to have a lander on the far side of the moon, which is the side that's always in dark. We're not planning to go there.
And why not? And what's the benefit of doing so?
We don't know what's on the backside of the moon, so that would be something that they would discover. But our decision is that it's more profitable for us to go to the South Pole of the moon because we think that's where the water is.
So why do you think they made that decision? I'm curious.
I have no idea.
Okay, let's talk a second about the imbalance sometimes we're concerned about in Maryland between science versus exploration missions. What future missions do you have intended for Goddard and the Science Mission Directorate, and how's the budget request affect those missions?
Well, Goddard is one of our great assets, and you have got all kinds of things at Goddard. For example, you've got coming up, we just announced today that we approved the Dragonfly mission, and it is in Maryland at the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins. That is going to the Saturn moon of Titan. If there is a planetary science mission, Goddard usually has something that it's involved in. So,
what about the Habitable Worlds Observatory? This would be at Goddard. We got $50 million for that. And are you willing to work with the committee to make sure this program has some increased funding to really make it work?
Not only work with you, we want it to work because the Habitable Worlds, which is one that'll go in the 2040s, you got to start it now. And its whole goal is to go out there and find other Earths. that there's carbon and there's water and it's got the right amount of distance from their sun looking for life, which is one of our charters, by the way, is to look for life. And so you've also got Da Vinci. It's going to Venus. You've got Landsat, which is, looking back at Earth, giving us all kinds of data. We've got 9 of those Landsats. The most recent one is, I think, Landsat 9. You've got this one that we just approved called Dragonfly. And just around the corner, you've got the next big telescope after the James Webb. And the James Webb is good for not only now, but for at least 20 years.
Spectacular.
Spectacular. You've got the Nancy Grace Roman telescope that, again, is helping identify other potential Earths out there as we are searching. And when we find those, by the way, not only looking for life, we start to understand their development and we better understand of who we are, why we're here, how we got here in all of this evolution of the cosmos.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Morelli?
Thank you, sir. I just have one question. Your budget request proposes a rapid ramp down of the Chandra X-ray Observatory budget, which partly assembled in my district by Eastman Kodak. But the district synergizes with the James Webb Space Telescope and has nearly, as I understand, a decade of mission life left. So I'm concerned that the decision diminishes our return on investment with the JWST and cedes U.S. leadership on X-ray astronomy. Would you be willing to look at reconsideration of that ramp down? And if not, tell me how we'll continue to have leadership in this area.
Remember I said we had to make hard choices? Now, Chandra has been the mission that has given us so many gifts, but it's been there for 25 years. And it's time for new missions. And when you cut us, and when I'm not saying that in any accusatory way, I'm saying had I been a member, I would have voted for that too, to save the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. That was the compromise you had to do. You had to cut non-defense discretionary.
But
you cut us $2 billion on science, just science, over the 2 years, 24 and 25. Let's start making that up in 26.
Well, I appreciate that, and it has been in operation for 25 years. My understanding is it's continuing to add to our knowledge base on X-ray astronomy, and that it does have useful life left. So I would think, and I understand new missions are important, but one that's working and really generating some results, I would think we would want to continue, and I would hope. I mean, obviously, I understand the need to prioritize, and frankly, I'd like to be spending more in your space, in your area. So I just ask you to, perhaps if we could have additional conversation, I'd like to ask you to reconsider on this.
Of course.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that concludes today's hearing. We want to thank our witness, Administrator Nelson, for being here with us, being generous with his time and information. Sir, we thank you for your service to your country.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a personal comment?
Please.
Of course, I've had the good fortune to have known you for quite a while. We served together in the House many, many moons ago. And as I look at your wall here and see all of those portraits, I've served with all of those former chairmen all the way back to Jamie Whitten. So it's a great privilege for me to return from whence I came. Thank you for the privilege.
Well, we're delighted with your presence and your service to both the House and the Senate, as well as now this most important job with the nation's space program. Without objection, members may have 7 days to submit additional questions for the record. The subcommittee stands adjourned. Well, that was actually